The year is 1814. Russian poet Ivan Krylov writes a fable about a man who goes to a museum and studies every exquisite detail in every piece, but fails to notice the elephant by his side. Ever since, when we refuse to acknowledge our most wicked problems, we call that the elephant in the room. Nearly 200 years later, Al Gore enlists the help of a polar bear to teach us the wickedly inconvenient truths of climate change. We have a long history of ignoring the difficult truths by our sides because acknowledging them means looking at ourselves differently. As someone who dances on the edge of the future, I am the biggest cheerleader of the coming AI-driven fourth industrial revolution. Bring it on, it'll be amazing. And I'm concerned that we remain blissfully ignorant about the damage we do. It's time to shine a light on the dark side of our work. For the past 30 years, I've been researching how we navigate change. Over 1 million people across the globe. And when I simplified hundreds of findings over the decades down to just one, I discovered the disruptive law of 1-to-1. This law states that for every person who is empowered, uplifted, and gloriously giddy because of what we do in disruptive technologies, there is also an equal and opposite impact. Somebody else's life just got a whole lot harder, more complicated, uncertain, possibly perilous because of what we do. The biggest obstacle in our way is that we create as many victims as victors. Disruption's original sin is that we assume no accountability for our victims. For example, Portia. Portia is a wonderful woman, proud, hardworking, but she's really struggling because of today's disruption. So much so, she cannot afford a place to live. She's living and sleeping out of her car. Let's see how well we understand the Portias of the world. For a show of hands. How many of you think that Portia is somebody who possibly voted for Trump because her entire industry is being decimated by disruption? How many of you think that's Portia? So we got about 20%. How many of you think Portia lives in the UK and voted for Brexit because other people are taking her job? Another 10% or so. The majority of you, I would say, show of hands, would vote that she lives in India and that she's the tech manager, having a hard time. Most of you, wow. Before I continue, take a moment to think about, why did you make that choice? Why did you decide that was Portia's profile? Because actually, the answer is none of the above. Portia is a Facebook employee in San Francisco. And she is just one example of the disruptive law of 1-to-1. For every person who can afford a $1,000 phone created by the Silicon Valley engine, there's somebody else in the Bay Area who cannot afford to live possibly anywhere near where she works. And the biggest impact that I see isn't even in economic measures. It's in how hard it is for so many of us to get through our day. I've asked hundreds of thousands of employees around the world about overload. Currently, 52%, again, half, say that it exceeds their ability to keep up. Now, these are your friends, family, neighbors. And they are really struggling, asking, what do I do? How do I change fast enough to keep up with all this? We are like digital coal factories spewing out massive amounts of brain pollution, claiming it's not really a problem. Well, yes, for half of us, it is. The hardest work in the future of work will be how each and every individual makes sense of everything in the cacophony of crap that comes at them. And on top of that, Microsoft recently did a study about attention span. Your users, their average attention span is that of a goldfish. Just a few seconds. Some academics claim to have debunked that, but my attention span was too short to read their findings. We are all ADD, and we are all creating attention deficit, defunction, and dysfunction and everything wherever we go. On top of that, another study by Jumio about millennials, the up-and-coming leaders and managers of the world. Jumio found that 20% of millennials in the US text while having sex. Now, if we can't pay attention to our partners for just a couple minutes at a time, what does that bode for how we use tomorrow's technologies? Well, so what? Why is this our problem and not theirs? Why should the tech disruptors worry about any of this? Because the damage that we do is about to grow exponentially. Our work sits at the transition between two eras. The digital era, the third industrial revolution, and the fourth revolution, where AI, machine learning, and robots will reinvent every single system that everybody uses. Exponentially so. So for a moment, put yourself in the other person's shoes. The current era, digital, for them, it's like drinking from a fire hose. They gulp just to get air, but they kind of get through their day eventually. Now along comes the fourth revolution, where every change is exponentially greater than the next one, and suddenly that pressure behind that fire hose is so intense that water, the source of all life, has been weaponized to the point where it cuts through people. Oxford University has said that in the next 25 years, nearly half of all of today's jobs will go away. And most everybody who talks about this gets it wrong from the personal perspective. Don't worry, they say, new jobs will pop up to take place of those old ones, so net, job opportunity growth. Absolutely true. But what's also true is that ignores how much trauma is thrust upon half of us over the next couple decades. Maurice Conti from Autodesk has said that how we work will change more in the next 20 years than in all of the past 2,000. Wow. Who the hell do you know that could keep up with that? How many of today's leaders and companies are designing for that kind of change? And the biggest impact of all is that the fourth revolution has no face, or skin color, or country. You see, for half of us, exponential change thrust upon us for the next couple decades means that there will be intense feelings of vulnerability of how do I create and control my own destiny with that much change swirling around me. And human nature is to bundle those kind of feelings and put them somewhere. Either focusing internally, which leads to depression, struggling to keep up, or even suicide. Or they focus it externally. Our victims will not rise up against our robots and algorithms. Instead, they will take that angst and anger and frustration and concern and vulnerability and direct it at immigrants and foreigners, nations and non-believers, police and teachers, flight attendants and cashiers. And this has already begun to happen. We, all of us, are facing a choice. Will we wait until that one-to-one crisis gets exponentially worse? Or will we get ahead of it now while we still have time? Will our model be the tobacco industry, where we spend decades denying truths, like the truths I just talked about? Will our model be a sex offender like Cosby or Weinstein, where we just keep imposing our will on somebody who didn't ask for it until our victims rise up in unison and say enough is enough? Or will we be servant leaders for all, not just half? Will we bring joy and grace and happiness to all, not just half? If we choose that path, there are three things all of us must do. And the first is to take personal accountability for your role in what's happening with the other half. Go talk to somebody who's really struggling. Learn about them. Learn what their needs are, and most importantly, learn about the impact of your unintended consequences. Secondly, take personal accountability for changing the conversation. The stories of half of the people we impact are not part of our daily conversation. Their stories matter, their voice matters, they matter. And finally, take personal accountability for creating new measures that track how we impact the other half. We are standing at the dawn of an amazing era. It truly will be amazing for at least half of us. What we do in the next few years will determine our legacy. It's time to choose. Will we be the disruptive heroes that this moment calls for? With grace and empathy and designs for all, not just half. Thank you.